pass it over to our TA providers, Nick Mitchell and David Dirks.
Hey everybody, great to be with you all. My name is Nick Mitchell. I am a senior policy analyst for Homebase. And like Midori was saying, Homebase is a HUD technical assistance provider. I'm sure many of you on the call have seen us before or worked with us. We've had the pleasure of working with some of you directly, with Host, intermittently with MDHI for the last 2 years. And so we're just grateful to be here, glad to be here with you all again, and excited to talk about Match. I will be leading the first half of the training on CoC Match. My colleague David Dirks will be leading the second half of the training at the 10 o'clock hour on ESG Match. But David, will you introduce yourself real quick? I'm sure you'll hear from David in and out too on this half of the training as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nick, and hi, everyone. David Dirks. As Nick stated, I will cover the ESG portion of this training. I'm assuming I will see maybe a few faces, familiar faces here, but I did pop something in the meeting chat. Please feel free to ask us any questions. Come off mute, interrupt Nick this hour or myself the next hour, or simply put your questions in the chat function. And what we can answer, we will. What we can't answer, we'll get back to you. But thank you very much, and thank you for attending this training.
Thanks, David. And yeah, we definitely don't mind the interruption. We like conversation. So if you're prompted with a question or a comment or a need for clarification, jump right in. And then we will pause at the end for questions if you're more comfortable, if you're a person that's more comfortable with that style. So today's training, match requirements for the CoC program in the first half. So really our goal is to give a general but kind of comprehensive overview of the scope of match requirements for CoC. So we hope you walk away with a good sense of the whole picture on match and hopefully learn something fresh that you didn't know. We will probably learn something that we didn't know as we enter these conversations. We always do. So that's kind of the plan, the hope, and I will go one slide to show you the agenda here for the day. So, or for this portion anyway, is to just get familiar with the concept of match in general. I assume there is a variety of or spectrum of knowledge on match as a topic in the room, in the team's room. So some of you may know very little about match. Some of you may know more than we do about match. And so that's great, and we'll try to give the whole range there. So have something that will be helpful to everybody. But we'll start from the beginning, understanding what match is, and then walk through just what are some of the key requirements of match for the CoC program, and then the third kind of component of the session will be walking through eligible uses for match funds. So what can you do with money or goods or services that will allow it to be counted as match for your program? And then lastly, we'll talk about eligible sources. So where can match funding or goods or services come from to be eligible? And of course, everybody's favorite topic, documentation. How do you document? How do you keep records? How do you make sure you have all that backup in place so that you can show that you have been utilizing match in eligible ways? So that's the plan. We'll go ahead and take it from the top and start just with the general question of what match is and get to a shared understanding. So definitionally, match is just a word we use for the non-federal share of costs that a recipient is required to contribute to accomplish the purposes of the grant. So for the CoC program, it's a 25% match requirement. So that means if you take your entire grant amount, and then actually in the CoC program you subtract the leasing budget line, so leasing does not generate a match liability. So take your entire grant amount, get rid of leasing, and then multiply it by 25%. And then the outcome of that equation is how much match you have to contribute to the program in order to meet the match requirement. So I'm going to go through 2 slides here that just kind of give some examples and additional detail on what is match, still from like kind of a definitional example standpoint. And then the next slide we'll share some examples that is what is not match. What are some things that might sound like match but actually would not be eligible to be used as match. So what is match? It must be cash, actual funds, or in-kind contributions. And that's something that we'll definitely talk more about. What kinds of in-kind contributions? What are the rules that surround those? And then second point, it has to cover eligible costs. So really, in my experience, there's kind of a spectrum of how match is executed in a community or carried out. So if you take like on the one end of the spectrum, like the care with which you treat your CoC funds. So you're very careful, you document everything, you want to make sure everything's eligible. And on the other end of the spectrum, in some communities, there's kind of a laissez-faire match approach, which is like, okay, we got this other funding, it was kind of going into the project, so I think we're good on match. What we want to encourage you to think about is to try with your match approach to be as close and as tight to the approach you take to your CoC funds with how you treat your match funds. And really there's a lot of requirements that make that pretty explicit, and we'll talk about that today. So that second point there, match has to cover eligible costs of the project, which we'll get into in more detail. Third point, costs incurred by a partner organization or contributed through a partner organization to provide in-kind services to program participants. And you see a lot of detail here. These have to be documented by an MOU. We'll talk about all that, but just to kind of get your mind working around what counts as match, those kinds of in-kind service delivery can be counted as match. And then last bullet, another example, program income to your program can be utilized as match. So the parenthetical example there is if you're receiving rent payments directly from clients, so a client portion of the rent can be something that's counted as match. All right, so what isn't match? What sounds like it might be, but actually isn't quite match? So cash or any in-kind contribution that's used as match for another grant. So you can't double use the same pot of funding to be matched for different grants. So if you have this pot of money, you can't use it to count as match for your ESG grant and your CoC grant. So no double counting. Then if you receive cash or in-kind contributions through a source that states or that prohibits its use as match, that one's obvious, but you can't use that as match for the CoC program. The third point here, any in-kind services provided without an MOU, and really that applies to any potentially eligible match source or use if you do it without documenting it. And we'll talk more about what the documentation needs to look like, but if you do it without documenting it, it's not technically eligible, and you might get hung up there. And then these last 2 points, try to make it very clear that anything that's a direct benefit to a program participant is not going to be eligible to be somehow transferred and counted as the program match. So if program participants have savings that they're building up in the program, or any federal benefits that they are accruing during the program, SNAP assistance, any form of direct benefit to the client cannot be counted as match. Those are great things. Those are great things that you want to be working on in your program. They're key performance measures, but they can't be transferred over and counted as match if it's something that's a direct benefit or something owned by the program participant. Okay, so hopefully that all kind of gets the juices flowing. You kind of get a sense of the idea of match. And now we'll move on and talk about some of the more specific key requirements. I'm going to take a sip of water. So, securing match contributions for the project and providing commitments. And I will just say, as an aside, I can't see the chat, so if something comes through, feel free to interrupt me on audio. Okay, so for the CoC program, the things you got to do, got to secure match contributions for the project and get commitments ahead of the grant agreement timeline, which we'll talk about too. You have to meet the 25% requirement on eligible activities over the grant term, and you have to be able to track and document all costs using the same kinds of policies and procedures that you use to document CoC program funding. So there's that spectrum again, keeping your approach to match really tight with how you approach your CoC funds. And then obviously following any procedures and reporting formats that a recipient, that the city, that the continuum might use to require you to report on your match. So kind of four things in here in the mix that you will hear over and over again from us today is, and this is kind of, I mean, a good, like if you take away 4 bullets about match, it has to be from an eligible source. It has to be an eligible use that it gets spent on or utilized for. You have to document consistently, and you have to incur the expenses or use the services during the grant term. So those 4 things: source, use, documentation, and timing. Those are kind of the key building blocks of a healthy approach to match.
Hey, Nick.
Yeah.
There is a question in the chat, and this might be something that we're getting toward, but Karen asked if rental assistance provided through a housing choice voucher is considered a federal benefit.
I don't think that would be considered a benefit in the sense of like what cannot be counted as match that we were talking about. I think we would need to hear more about what that situation actually looks like to know to be able to say like, yes, that can be counted as match or not. So if Karen, if you want to say more about that, or we can
Karen
say
is at the airport. I also was like, I'm surprised Karen's here because I feel like we had a conversation. She can't unmute, but they have project-based vouchers in a CoC property. So it sounds like the housing choice vouchers at the CoC property. And so I guess the question I would surmise would be like, if I have a voucher in a project-based, can I use the voucher as match for the rest of my program?
I think so, off the top of my head, unless there's any kind of prohibition on that I'm not aware of. David, if you know any more about that, please jump in. But in terms of like the structure of it, you're receiving rental assistance, which is a CoC eligible use from another source that's contributing to your CoC project. So I would think, based on the structure, that'd be okay. But again, I haven't faced that question specifically.
Yeah, I think that's what she said, would the assistance paid for these residents be used as match? And I think the way that you're describing it is yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I agree with that too. I'm also searching while Nick, you continue. I'll just search and see if I can find any backup that supports that. But I think exactly sort of talking through some of these questions is probably the right thing to do when thinking about some of these sources. Like it's easy if you have a separate grant from a private foundation or something that says, I'll match your COC. That's easy. What's not so easy is sometimes these situations where you do have another source and talking through it, how you're using it is smart for everybody on the call. So.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, David. Thank you, Midori. Thank you, Karen. Cool. I think we got through everything here, so I will move on to the next slide, which brings us to the next section, which is eligible uses for match. So what can you do with funding, with donations, with services that will allow it to be counted as match? So what you see here is a chart that tells you on the left-hand column the eligible costs, and then the across the axis at the top, you have the CoC project types. And so this chart is simply telling you what you can use CoC money for. So if you have a PSH project, you can do any of the things, utilize any of the eligible costs in that first column. And then if you look at the second, rapid rehousing, you can do anything starting at rental assistance and below, and only tenant-based. So this is a chart that tells you what you can do with CoC funds, which is exactly what you can do with match funds. So I think this is going to be clear to some people, but for sometimes there is some confusion about if I'm receiving funding for this project that I operate, then it can be matched. It doesn't have to be a CoC eligible use. So like if we're having a party at our PSH project and we bring in a band and we pay for the band, well, that's going to my PSH project, so we can count that as match. And no, that's not the case. Everything that you're going to count as match has to be something that you could have spent your CoC funds on. So that's why this chart is just the same chart you see for eligible costs for the CoC program. And that's really, I think, one of the simplest things about match, but something that gets missed is the eligible costs are the same as the eligible costs for the grant itself. So we're going to move now to, that's the shortest section because it's really the easiest answer. But now we're going to move to eligible sources and documentation, which there's a decent bit more detail on some of this stuff. So two types of match. You've heard these terms coming up already multiple times, but you can utilize cash match, or you can utilize in-kind match. So we're going to talk about what each of those is and how you can document the use of those and how those documentation requirements kind of shift based on what you're doing. So cash match, it's when a recipient or subrecipient spends actual funds, actual money on eligible program costs. And it counts as match only if it can be demonstrated that a payment of the funds was made to cover the costs of program eligible activities expended during the grant term. So there you see those four components again. Eligible source, eligible use, happened within the grant term, and you can document it. So a little bit more then on eligible sources. So where can cash come from that allows it to be used as match? So you can use grants from private, state, local, and federal sources. Again, like hearkening back to our what is not match slide, they can't be prohibited by the source requirements from being used as match. You can also utilize your agency's own cash resources that can go towards match. Revenues from fundraising efforts. Obviously, that's private income for the agency, and that's an eligible use or eligible source, sorry, for match. And then any staff that you have that are working on what would be grant eligible activities, but the staff are not being paid from the CoC program, but from other agency sources, that work, that funding going to pay those staff can be an eligible source of match. And that's the case for any eligible activity or any staff or personnel that are doing CoC eligible activities that you could pay them from the CoC program for. Okay, so now we're going to move on to documentation for cash, and then we're going to go back through the same cycle of slides for in-kind as well. So what you see on this slide is just a simple table that tells you different timing intervals and the documentation that's required at each of those intervals. So the first timing interval being prior to the grant period. To document cash match, you have to provide a commitment letter. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Second timing interval throughout the grant period, you have to do consistent financial tracking and documentation as match is expended. So in the same way that you're tracking your CoC program grant expenses, you have to have that level of record of your cash match expenses as well, so that you can show we've been spending this on eligible activities within this time frame, and the source from which these expenditures are coming. So the third timing interval that you see is actually specific to Denver, a requirement Denver is implementing. So this is not a federal requirement that you're seeing in that third timing interval, but midway through the grant period, doing a midterm grant report, which is a practice that some recipients choose to do just so they have a point within the grant period to check in to see if subrecipients are on track with their match expenditures. And then the fourth interval at the finish of the grant period. And so kind of we're back to a broader requirement, a final grant report of some kind with documentation so that the recipient has everything it needs to demonstrate to HUD that it has met the match obligation for its overall grant. And so wanted to say a couple things more about this commitment letter prior to the grant period. So this has to be secured, provided on agency letterhead, and include some specific information in order for the match to be eligible and documented before that grant period. So it needs to include the amount of cash to be provided for the project, the date that funding will be available, the grant year to which the cash is being contributed, and the time period for which funding will be available, and the activities that money is going to fund. So that commitment letter does need to try to be as specific as possible to indicate the scope of the match, what it's doing, when it's happening, all that good stuff.
I actually have a question about the commitment letter.
Yes.
Can the commitment letter happen at the time of the NOFO application, or does it have to happen like at the time of award and contract?
It can happen anytime before the grant agreement is signed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to in-kind match. So different from cash match. In-kind is when a recipient or subrecipient uses the value of in-kind contributions, whether that's property, equipment, goods, or services that are contributed to the project as match. So here on the slide, you see again the test that you have to run this through to see if it's eligible. So if the subrecipient or recipient could pay for any of these services or goods with their CoC grant funds, then they can be eligible as match, but not otherwise. For in-kind match documentation, the requirements vary a little bit depending on whether you're utilizing property, goods, equipment, or services. So we'll talk about each of those and the documentation requirements. So same table that you saw earlier for cash match. So you have these 4 timing intervals, and then the second row tells you the documentation requirement for goods and equipment. And then the third row is telling you the documentation requirement for services. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these because of that distinction. So for goods and equipment, these require, like cash match, a commitment letter. And that commitment letter has to have that same kind of specificity, except in this case, it does have to speak to the value of the donated goods that are being contributed and include some sort of valuation method or documentation. So it can't just be, hey, we're going to provide all this computer equipment. It has to be, what is the value of that computer equipment and how have you gotten to that value amount? And then the same requirements as we already talked about for cash match in terms of the information that needs to be in that commitment letter, such as the specific date that the goods will be made available, the grant year that it's being contributed, and the allowable activities that will be provided or supported by the donation. And then for
I have a quick question on that in-kind match. For partnerships that we have with mental health centers who may be providing services, they may not provide a total amount for the contract year because it'll be based on the direct service that they're having with folks. Is it acceptable to just have the hourly rate on there that they're providing and not a full total for the year?
Yep. So everything I just said about the commitment letter and the value requirements only applies to goods or equipment. So for services.
Okay, sorry.
Yep. So for services, we'll jump into that right now. And you're right. You don't need the total year's value listed. And there's actually, it's not, and it's not the same requirement of a commitment letter. It's an MOU. And so
right
in that MOU, the subrecipient and the agency providing the in-kind services have to enter into an agreement. And in that agreement, you have to reference the system that you're using to value services. So if that's a rate and an amount of hours, something that gets you to a clear place. So essentially you would need to be showing that you can meet the total match obligation. Obviously, it can go over that, but you don't want to undershoot it. So to that question, like, I don't know that you would need necessarily like the specific total amount because it is going to be a rate and an estimated amount of hours, but you also want to be showing that you can meet the full match obligation. Does that make sense? And is there any follow-up?
No follow-up because we have maybe with several partners who are supporting our CoC funded programs. So I think what we're doing makes sense. We're there and we talk about number of hours, but we don't necessarily have the total amount on there. But what we submit does total.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think at the end of the day, if it's something that the recipient's comfortable with, they know that because you have multiple partners, that you're going to get to a place of meeting the total amount and then submitting that in report form, then I think that all shakes out in a way that works.
I'll just add to just with a lot of these things, especially sort of the goods and products, as well as sort of the services piece, especially for salaries. I always remember to sort of use best accounting principles, best valuation principles when determining what the value of something is. When we hire folks, sometimes we have to develop a budget and earmark what we're going to spend for a year or for a period. So, just to add to what you were saying, Cassie, having the hourly rate, but also knowing sort of what the average is for providing services or those salary supports, then that would be better. It would be better to have and be able to document that than not. And that's just from a monitoring perspective and HUD compliance perspective. You want to make sure that you're using whatever best practices are for that field when determining a lot of these things, because you do have a little wiggle room.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, David. And there is I have a note here, and I think this is in the CoC regulation. It could be in supplemental HUD guidance, but I think it's directly from the CoC regulation that when you establish a system evaluation for services, those services have to be valued at rates that are consistent with folks who are, or positions that are ordinarily paid for similar work within this recipient or subrecipient's organization. And if there's not similar work within the organization, then you need to make that valuation based on similar positions within the local labor market. So that's just something to be aware of too, that you can't just have volunteers in doing something and say, well, if we were paying them, we'd want to pay them at a living wage or whatever, and so that's what we're doing our match for. But then if there's people at your own organization doing similar work that are receiving minimum wage, you can't have that discrepancy between how you value your services, but have to have that valuation written into these documents. So then the rest of this timeline that you have in front of you is pretty much the same as with cash match, just throughout the grant period. Again, consistent tracking and documentation. With services, those services need to be documented as they occurred. So volunteer hour logs, these kinds of things, to make sure that the hours being worked are clearly documented with the timing, with the activity, etc., so that you have a basis for how you're calculating the total match that's been generated through those services. And then, of course, the final and midterm grant reports. So that is the full scope of kind of the big picture of match for CoC. We can open it up now to see if anybody has any questions, talk through any examples if you would like to. And David, Midori, if you have anything else you want to add, please jump in. But otherwise, we'll take some questions and then have a little break before we turn over to the ESG side at the top of the hour.
Yeah, I don't know if Karen left us already. I think that I just saw a message maybe that says she did. I didn't find anything right on point as it relates to HCBs. but I did find a question that was submitted to the HUD AAQ. And caveat here, HUD AAQ is very specific to the question and the community in which the question was asked for, who submitted it. But this is general stuff. So the question was, can entitlement CDBG funds be used as a source of matching funds for the youth homeless demonstration program? So it was very specific to that. But the answer that was provided from the HUD desk says that under the CoC program, funds from any federal source, including HUD funds, but excluding other CoC funds, which we stated in the presentation, as well as state, local, and private sources may be used for match, as long as they are not statutorily prohibited by their source. CDBG funds are not statutorily prohibited from being used as matching funds. So I'm now searching to see if HCV funds are statutorily prohibited, which I'm pretty sure they are not. So Karen's question should be probably answered in the positive, and that probably is a good source for match for them.
Awesome. Thank you, David.
No problem. Any other questions, folks?
I was thinking deeper about the match commitment letter question because we do ask for commitment for match when we are doing our NOFO application, but the numbers wouldn't necessarily be the same, right? Because your award could be different than what you applied for. So it probably needs to be redone. Is that a logical course of thought?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is expected. I would say that, those are the type of things that are probably going to change throughout sort of the process of the grant cycle. And it's probably expected to change. I think for the recipients and the sub-recipients purposes is, all right, do you have funds secured to match this grant if we were to give it from a very good source, that something's just not going to fall through. And I think that's really what's being looked at in the commitment letter. Sometimes it's good to know. I know a lot of these applications ask about sort of how long the relationship has been with the organization, and sort of the financial health and all of these other kind of good things to support sort of these funds are going to be there. We believe that they're going to be there, and we're not going to have any problems with the match requirement. And I think ultimately, as sub-recipients and for the providers here, that's what you want to show to Midori or to the city to host.
Yeah, and just to add in there too, like, I feel like to the extent that, as a former grant administrator, to the extent that you can avoid revising things, that's a good thing. So I think there's a path to kind of build it into your process for that, Midori. Like if in the commitment letter, the subrecipient or the applicant includes like, we can match up to $500,000. That's what we're applying for. We're able to match up to this amount. And then if they're awarded less than that, then in the contracts, you can have the actual grant amount, or in any kind of award letter, it can say, your match obligation, though you could match up to 500, is reduced to 350 or whatever the case may be. I think that would probably cover it.
I had one. When is the midterm reporting requirement going to be implemented?
So hosts is processing grant agreements right now, and have some grants that have already started that are not contracted out, but it will be this year.
Okay, we have our program, the funding year started March 1, and so that won't be covered.
I don't have any contracts that start in March, so I don't know if that's different funds.
Well, it's CoC.
Okay,
through
I
ND?
only, yeah, our Bedrock one starts in November.
Okay.
Um,
And the other question, we have a line item where we pay wages for tenants. And if we hire them beyond that line item, is that considered a match?
Well, it depends on what work the tenants are doing. If the tenants are doing tasks that are eligible staff costs for the CoC program activity. So if it's something you could pay any other staff member to do as an eligible CoC cost, then it shouldn't matter if it's a tenant or not. If you're paying tenants to do a task that would not be an eligible cost for the CoC program, then just because they're tenants wouldn't allow it to be match. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, unfortunately.
Oh no.
Right.
Dave, I'm sorry. Now I'm curious to know what type of things are the tenants doing?
Well, we've had them help with, well, one particular tenant I'm thinking of who no longer does this helped with data in our main office.
That
And
probably
we paid them out of our CoC funds because our whole program is set up as work oriented and trying to get people into the workplace. And so this particular person had a training position, we called it, in the data group team. Okay, and then we've had other people that then went. We have a number of federal job sites where, like, we run the switchboard at the VA or the various federal jobs throughout the community, and I was wondering if we could use the wages that some of the people we've started and trained and then got placed out into those jobs as part of, because they may never have gotten the jobs without all the work related to our housing, if they could be used, if that wage could be used as part of the match.
interesting.
Can you maybe research that?
Well,
I feel like
that's
that's a
why
good
I asked
HUD
the
rep
question.
question.
Pardon
Yeah,
me?
that's a good hub wrap question. I think you should definitely um contact the HUD rep for the Denver area, because it's very specific to what you all are doing. The first example seemed to be eligible activity. It's entering data, like any other staff would be for the COC program.
Right.
So that example, based, what Nick said, makes sense. The second example, um, yeah, but I would definitely reach out to the HUD rep on both, just to make sure that what you all are doing doesn't run afoul of the match requirements, but also to figure out how you can keep doing it, because
Yeah.
it sounds
Right.
cool and very beneficial to the tenant. So
Yeah,
yeah, I
absolutely.
would definitely reach out.
And I had one more question. We deliver a number of food boxes from our food pantry to that facility every week. Although I would think that would be eligible for part of the match, but valuing that those boxes, how do you propose or suggest that I come up with a methodology?
You value those boxes based on the food cost, and the materials used. So whoever you're ordering the food from needs to give you a cost per box, and then that's how you value it.
What we get
I-
in big bulks, and so can we value it at the market rate of those kind of groceries?
Now that's a good question. And probably a question for the HUD office as well. I will say, in
That's
another community
into
that I'm working in, um, is actually using ESG dollars, but we could use the example here. The food bank is providing food street outreach, so food to people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So same thing, sort of in order to value, you got to look at the food costs, and it's probably going to be what the value you paid for the food, not the market rate. So again, I think that unfortunately, I know it's bulk pricing, but you know, you got to figure out some type of way to, divvy that up that it makes sense. For per box that you're providing. If it's a banana, a sandwich, a bag of chips, and some water, whatever that may be, then looking to see how much a banana costs, the unit per price, the unit price, how much the sandwich costs, unit price for wherever you're getting it is probably your best bet. Takes a little bit of digging and research, but it shouldn't take that much digging and research, because literally they're ordering the items, and I would say just stick to the food cost. I wouldn't put in the cost of assembling that and all that kind of stuff. That might get a little bit too difficult to put a amount to. I would stick to the food costs. But again, I think that these are also questions to ask. That's definitely a question to ask the HUD rep, because you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is proper.
Right. Okay, thank you so much.
Sure thing.
And just real quick to jump back to the employment questions too, just you can always keep that simple test in your head. If I could pay a staff member with CoC funds to do this work, then I can pay a tenant to do this work with non-CoC funds, and that would count as match. That's just the simple test to do with any of that stuff. Sweet. Do we have any other questions? Appreciate all the ones that have come in so far. Good stuff. If no more questions, Midori or David, any thoughts before we take a break and return at the top of the hour for the ESG training?
No, just thank you. I'm just always always so grateful for the support you guys provide. So I hope this was beneficial to other CoC recipients as well. And then I'll stop the recording on this one and start a new recording and hopefully figure out how to get it somewhere where folks can see it. But so is there any other questions though? Just want to make sure. And if you wanted to reach out directly to your HUD rep or to home base, there's a David or Nick, can you put the home base email in the chat? Then you can do that. Or of course you can reach out to MDHI as well.
Yeah, and thank you, Midori, for having us. Thanks everybody for coming. We love talking through this stuff with you all, and appreciate very much the work that you all are doing in your community.
And I'm adding it now. Give me 1 second.
Thanks. Then I'm going to stop the recording on this and we'll resume at 10 o'clock.